Good morning, everybody, online and in person here in the hall. Welcome back on this beautiful sunny day, and thank you for attending this joint meeting of the Pension Committee and Pension Board on the 15th of June 23. You will be aware this meeting will be live streamed and thereafter on the Falkirk Council YouTube channel. Some housekeeping before we formally start. After agenda item 11, we'll have a 10-minute break before agenda item 12, which is the exclusion of the public. If the agenda takes longer than anticipated, we can break sooner, or if a member requests a break. I welcome all questions and we encourage you to ask to enable you to understand the complex reports and decisions. As we know, responsibility for the governance of the pension fund sits with our pension committee as delegated by Falkirk Council, the administrating authority. The pensions committee is supported by our pensions board to ensure that decisions are made with the terms of the fund rules and with good practice. We will now start the business formally. Do we have any apologies?
We do, Convener. We've got apologies from Andy Douglas from Unison, Tony Calleary from Unison as well, Ed Morrison, and from David Wilson from Clackmannanshire Council.
Thank you, Mr. Peary. Declarations of interest. Members should declare any financial and non-financial interest they have in any item of the business at the meeting, identifying the relevant agenda item and the nature of the interest. No? Thank you. Agenda item 3 is the minute. That is the minute of the Pensions Committee and Board that was held on the 16th of March 2023. I'll give you a couple of minutes if you've not already read it. Then through. I've got a question from Councillor Spears.
Thank you. Regarding the minute, firstly, I would say that I've not had an agenda sent out, but I would imagine that I've not had an answer to the questions that was asked regarding minimum wage earners' pensions that you, convener, said you'd look into for me.
Regarding the agenda, Mr. Peary, could you speak about that?
I think it's not the case that agenda wasn't sent out. Agenda was issued. I'm not sure what could have happened that, so can only apologise. It must be held up in the post. But unfortunately, we can't rectify that at this moment, but we'll look into it. I'm not sure if I can help with the question. I think Amanda might want to help with that.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, Councillor Spears. I know that this is an area that you're particularly interested in. It was raised at the Pensions Committee, if I recall correctly, it was raised as well at either Executive or Council. And I suppose it's just to re-emphasise the point that we are a defined benefit scheme, but we don't decide on what benefits people will receive. That's decided nationally. And in legislation, and we just have to follow that legislation. So as a committee, we don't have the ability to change the benefits that anyone will receive through their local government pension scheme. Thank you.
Yeah, it just seems very unfair that our minimum wage earners, when they retire, have a very poor pension. We've just been in a briefing session where we see our investments are performing particularly well, and it would be really good if we could lead the way and help our minimum earners.
Thank you, Councillor Spears. Regarding the minute, has everybody read the minute? Are we all clear on that? Thank you. The next agenda item is rotation of the chair of the board, and this will be presented by Catherine Crothers. Sorry about that, I need to catch my button. As you're aware, the fund is required to maintain a pension board that is separate from the Pensions Committee. The pension board is made up of an equal number of employer and member representatives, and our board comprises of 4 employer representatives and 4 member representatives. The member representative positions are filled by our trade unions. The role of the pension board is to provide an oversight function, assisting the council in its role as scheme manager of the Falkirk Council Pension Fund by securing compliance with the rules relating to scheme governance and administration, securing compliance with requirements imposed by the pensions regulator, and any other matters that may be specified in legislation. The chair of the board also provides a statement for the fund's annual report and accounts, which covers the work that has been undertaken by the board over the scheme year, which runs every 1 April to 31st March, ensuring the effective and efficient governance and administration of the fund. The chair of the board also meets with senior officers up to twice a year to review the fund's risk register. Under the board constitution, the employer and member representatives each appoint a chair of the board, and the chair then rotates annually between the employer and member representatives. Over the past year, the chair has been David Morgan, an employer representative, and the chair now passes to a member representative, Mr. Tony Cleary. Both David Morgan and Ed Morrison, who are employer representatives on the board, will be stepping down after this meeting and will be respectively replaced by Angela Malloy and Ross McKenzie. Thank you, Kathleen, for that presentation, that report. I'm now going to open it. Do we have any questions on this agenda item? Rotation of the chair of the board? No, none. Firstly, but I would like to say something. On behalf of the committee and the board, I really want to say a big thank you to David Morgan in his role as chair of the board and for his valuable expertise during this past year. We all wish him well in his future endeavours. Also, I would like to welcome to the board our new chair of the board, which is Tony Cleary, who was a member representative who will continue, I'm sure, to provide us with great insight due to his lengthy experience. Thank you. Moving on now to agenda item 5, which is the Pension Fund External Audit Annual Audit Plan, and I welcome Pauline Gillen to the committee and board here today. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you, convener. As this is my first attendance at committee, I just thought I would, by way of a brief introduction. So I'm Pauline Gillen, Audit Director with Audit Scotland, and I will be the Pension Fund's appointed auditor for the next 5-year period. And my colleague, Gillian McCready, who's a senior manager on the audit, was at your last committee. And just to apologise for any of this annual audit plan. Typically, we'd expect this to come to your March committee, and in future years, that would be our intention. This being the first year of a new audit appointment round, there was considerable work in setting up the new team, and the March deadline was just a little bit too early for us. But going forward, I'd expect to bring this plan to you at your March committee. I think that the covering paper it provides a really good summary of the main things that are in the plan. So I'm not going to talk to the paper in too much detail. The one thing I'd like to do is just draw to your attention a couple of important points in the plan. So at Exhibit 2, so I think that's page 28 of the pack, we outline the significant risks of material misstatement that we identified as part of our planning and risk assessment process. The first one there is a risk that members will be familiar with. It appears in all annual audit plans for all audited bodies, and that's the risk of material misstatement due to fraud caused by management override of controls, which sounds a bit scary, but it just reflects the unique position that management are in to perpetrate fraud by overriding the controls in the financial systems. So as I said, that's a standard risk that you'll see in all annual audit plans. The final column there outlines a planned audit response. So that's the specific work that the team will carry out during the year and as part of the final accounts process in order for us to address that risk. and we will report in our annual audit report in September on the findings from that work. The second risk and material misstatement we've identified, again, is one members will have seen before, and it's just in relation to the significant degree of subjectivity in the measurement and valuation of investments, typically some level 2 and level 3 investments. So again, we've outlined the work that we'll do to address that risk. A lot of it relates to the information provided to us by your investment managers. We've also considered risks of fraud in the recognition of income and expenditure, and in the paragraphs below there we've outlined the reasons why we do not think there's a significant risk in these areas, and we have therefore rebutted the risk for this year. It doesn't mean that we won't do any work on income and expenditure, it just means that we're not doing any additional work over and above the typical work that we would carry out as part of the final accounts process. Other areas of audit focus, we're required to carry out some work in line with ISA 500 to enable us to rely on the work of Hymans Robertson as the fund's actuary. And that's a piece of work that we carried out on all bodies with pension funds. Wider scope work. Members will be aware that the Code of Audit Practice requires us to consider wider areas over and above the audit of the financial statements, and those 4 bullet points there outline what those areas are. You'll have seen those before. I think the last 2 are worded slightly differently. I think in previous years we called them governance and transparency and value for money, perhaps, but the wording of those have been tweaked a little bit, but they broadly are similar to what you'll have seen in previous years. For audit year 22-23, all auditors have been asked to carry out some additional work with regard to climate change and cyber security. So the team will also be carrying out some work in these areas, and we note the work that internal audit's done specifically on cyber security, and we'll be relying on that work as part of our reporting in the annual audit report. The final section is on the reporting arrangements, timetable and audit fee, and the Exhibit 4 outlines the proposed annual accounts table that the team have agreed in discussion with officers, aiming to get the unaudited accounts to start the audit process at the start of July, aiming for sign-off by the 21st of September. That was all I'd planned to say in the report, convener, but I'm happy to take any questions that members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline. We do have some questions. Councillor Steenbank, you have a question for Pauline?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, thanks, convener. I'm getting a wee bit of feedback, so I'll try and just go ahead. I'm page 30 of the pack, and it's page 8 of the report. Talks about pension benefits being the main expenditure, and this rebuts the risk of fraud. Could you just expand on why that is, basically?
Yes. It probably seems a bit strange to think about that and not consider there to be an element of fraud, particularly given the numbers. For us as auditors, we look at the controls that are in place around any expenditure that's made, and we carry out specific work to consider the key controls that are in place around any payments that go out of the fund. And from the work that we've carried out and for our understanding of the fund, we don't consider there to be a significant risk of fraud in that area. In order for there to be fraud, that would be, and when we talk about significant risks, we specifically talk about it in relation to our materiality level, and the materiality level is, let me just check, £64 million. So for there to be a material misstatement in that area, we feel that it would be unlikely. As I said, it doesn't mean we're not doing any work on it, so we do work on the controls, and we also do substantive testing during the financial accounts process, but we just don't think there's any additional risk that would require us to do any additional work over and above what we would do typically.
Thanks very much. That makes a lot clearer understanding of that section. My second question is just about the climate change element on page 31 of the report, page 9 of the appendix. The Auditor General and Accounts Commissioner developing work in relation to the fund's responsiveness to climate change. Will this include an evaluation of the effectiveness of the engagement investment strategy by the fund?
So the inclusion of climate change in all of our bodies, you'll appreciate across the public sector the huge wide range of bodies that are included. Primarily, this is about the pension fund as a body and its arrangements for climate change. We recognise a lot of that will be perhaps linked to the council. Going further than that, we anticipate that this type of work will be something that will appear each year. So for this year, we have some very set questions that we're asking to address this area of work, and we expect that in future years it might go into another level. So this might be, for this year, it'll be very high level. Do you have a strategy in place? Do you report on? Do you have targets? Do you report on them? So it'll be very high level. But I anticipate in future years we'll probably get into a bit more detail about the fund. Over and above that, we would expect areas like that to be reported on in our annual audit report, but it doesn't specifically fall under climate change. But yes, that wider recognition of environmental and social areas we will report on in the annual audit report, but that we would do that anyway over and above this piece of work.
Thanks for that. So just to clarify, would that include the investments as well that the fund makes, or just from that I'm thinking we might be getting a report on the internal work and, you know, the effectiveness of office buildings or whatever. I'm just trying to understand whether this is going to go into detail. I understand it will be a first year, so it will be more high level and structural, but will we go into greater detail on the investments and the effectiveness of the investments on broader climate change, or are we going to be talking about essentially just the internal climate change implications of the work?
I would expect to cover both this year, but as
Very
you
cool.
rightly said, probably the level of detail might change in future years. But yes, both of those areas will be touched upon this year.
No, thanks, I appreciate that, Pauline. Thanks, convener.
Thank you, Councillor Steenback. That was good points you made there, and as was said, that in future years there will be more detail into that matter. Do we have any further questions on this agenda item? No? So I'm going to go to the recommendation now. The committee and board are asked to note the annual audit plan proposed by Audit Scotland in relation to the audit of the pension fund annual report and accounts for 22-23. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Moving on now, the next report is agenda item 6, which is the Internal Audit Annual Assurance Report, and this will be presented and taken by Sarah McPhee.
Thank you, convener. So this report is the 22-23 Internal Audit Annual Assurance Report. The purpose of this report is to summarise the work Internal Audit have undertaken over the course of last year and to provide an overall opinion on the Council's arrangements for risk management, governance and control based on that work. The report also comments on our compliance with public sector internal audit standards. I'll point you to section 2. I asked the Audit Committee to note that sufficient internal audit work was undertaken to support a balanced assurance, and the internal audit can provide substantial assurance on the fund's arrangements for risk management, governance and control for the year to the 31st of March 2023. Section 3 of the report explains the reviews undertaken as part of the 22-23 internal audit plan, which was approved by the Pension Committee. Section 4 describes the approach taken for internal audit work, and it is noted that a sample of 60 was taken, and at paragraph 4.5 details are noted of a minor discrepancies. As stated though, these have been rectified with additional checks now implemented. Paragraphs 4.7 to 4.12 notes the impact of a complex cyber attack on one fund employer, which has resulted in detailed guidance being issued. In order to mitigate an incident or attack, the risk has been included in the Council's and the Fund's risk registers, as well as being in receipt of a range of external assurances. Section 5 of the report comments on our compliance with public sector internal audit standards. These set out the principles and practices that we must comply with, and every year we're required to undertake a self-assessment against the standards. This was given assurance that we operate in line with these standards and was undertaken by internal audit during March 2023. There is also a 5-yearly external assessment, which the last section underwent during 2018 and were found to be compliant. We're coming round again this year. Our external assessment will be carried out by Fife Council over the summer, of which we're still to agree an exact month. Thank you for your time, and I'll try and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up for questions now. Does any of the members have a question for Sarah? No? No questions then? I've actually, it's more a mention actually. I just want to say I'm really pleased to see, I know it's quite a simple thing, the definitions of the level assurance as in Appendix 1. That is really helpful, and it's to understand what the substantial meaning is. Substantial assurance. So no more questions then. I'll go to the recommendations. It is recommended that Pensions Committee and Pension Board note that sufficient internal audit work was undertaken to support a balanced assurance. Internal audit can provide substantial assurance in respect of the fund's arrangements for risk management, governance and control for the year 31st of March. And the internal audit section operated in compliance with public sector internal audit standards, and there's been no impairment to the scope or independence of internal audit activity during the year. So do we all agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. I'm now going to move on now to the internal audit plan. And this will be taken by Sarah again. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. This paper sets out a proposed programme of works for 23-24. After discussion with the pension manager, there are two main areas for review. Firstly, which is detailed at paragraph 4.1, will be undertaking the transactional testing on the fund. This will be achieved by sample checking new members, pension rights have been transferred in and out correctly, retiring fund members have received the correct pension payments, and lump sum payments have been correctly paid. At paragraph 4.2, we will undertake a review of investment control arrangements. The review will focus on ensuring the recommended internal controls are operating effectively and the insurances are consistent with the mitigating controls from the fund risk register. At paragraph 4.3 to 4.5 provides some background to the audit process, including the preparation of our annual assurance statement. So to finish, I'll draw your attention to recommendations at paragraph 2.1. In particular, can I ask the committee to approve the internal audit plan for the year, but to bear in mind the need to be flexible and the internal audit will direct resources to where they're most needed. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Councillor Spears, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for your report. You were saying you want to direct resources to where they're most needed. So I return to my question I've asked at previous meetings regarding the minimum wage earners and the poor pension they receive. Can any of these funds be directed to them?
Councillor Spears, I think Amanda's mentioned before that this isn't something that's in the control of the Pensions Committee. So I don't think it's a relevant question. I think Amanda might want to come in.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Sarah. I think Councillor Spears, my reading of Sarah's point on resources was about redirecting internal audit resources to certain areas within the audit plan. As I say, as I've already said, we don't have any scope to change how much pensions benefits people on minimum wage get. It's simply not within our gift. We wouldn't be allowed to do that.
Would you recommend we lobby the Westminster Parliament or the Scottish Government?
I was going to say, Councillor Spears, if you do have any questions in future, or if you want some more information on topic you raised, certainly send an email to myself and we'll get you further information. And
yeah, that would be great if I received an agenda.
Okay, Councillor, we'll make sure you receive our agenda in future. Okay, Councillor Spears, but thank you for your question. Is there any more questions? No? I do have actually just a small question, and it's a question at the relevant to 4.5, and it's mentioned which month will the audit annual assurance report be presented to the Pensions Committee and the Pension Board? Will it be the same month every year? Or is it dependent when the work is done? Because it talks about an annual report on an annual basis.
It usually tries to be for the next available committee after the 31st of March. We usually try and get, because the year will finish on the 31st of March, and we'll try and get all our work concluded and any assurance statements issued for the very next committee.
That's great. Thanks very much, Sarah. So the recommendation, it's recommended that the Pension Committee agrees the proposed Falkirk Council Pension Fund Internal Audit Plan 23-24 and notes the annual assurance report will be provided. Are we all agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. So swiftly moving on again, we're actually moving on to agenda item 8, which is the valuation assumptions. And we have Julie West here, I believe, to take the report.
Yes, morning everybody. Thanks for having me along today. For those that I don't know, I'm Julie West. I'm the fund actuary. I'm a partner at Hyman Robertson. So we'll be working really closely with the fund officers over the next year on the completion of the formal valuation. So as a bit of a reminder, when we're doing the formal valuation, really the purpose of this exercise is to make sure that the fund is collecting sufficient contributions along with investment returns that we expect the fund to earn, to make sure there's enough money available to pay the members' benefits as they fall due. The way in which we do that is we collect data on every member of the fund. We gather the data on the pension benefit they've earned so far, and we project that into the future. So each and every year into the future, that we expect those pension benefits to be paid. One of the really key things that we have to do to do that projection is to set a set of assumptions that allows that projection to happen. So for example, things like what salary increases we expect members to be awarded, the pension increases that we expect to be awarded to members' benefits every year, how long we expect members to live for. And so we've carried out a detailed exercise with the funds officers looking at the entirety of that set of assumptions. So when we look at assumptions, we tend to look at them in two categories. So there's financial assumptions and demographic assumptions. If we take the demographic assumptions first, the biggest one of those is life expectancy. The difference of 1 year extra life expectancy adds on round about 4% to the fund's liabilities. So it's quite a significant assumption, definitely the most important out of the demographic assumptions. The way in which we set that assumption, the fund uses a company called Club Vita, and they set a life expectancy assumption for each individual member of the fund. So it looks at how much pension or salary they've earned contained in the data. It looks at postcode information, and it assigns an assumption to each individual member. And what we've seen from using that approach is at previous valuations, when we look at how close those estimates are, they do tend to be pretty close to where we had assumed to be. So that's what we call the baseline assumption. That's what life expectancy is currently. There's a second part to that assumption, which is what we call the future improvement. So we know that life expectancy is not static. Life expectancy changes over time, and life expectancy is continuing to increase, albeit at a slower pace than what we saw through the 2000s. And we rely on there's a model called CMI. It's produced by the actuarial profession. They do a detailed study into life expectancy improvements, and we rely on that model to set the future improvement assumption. One really key thing at this valuation will be the impact of COVID, unsurprisingly. So we did the last valuation at 31st of March 2020. And that CMI model does allow us to make make some allowance for the impact of COVID on life expectancy that we will be including within the life expectancy assumptions. The other set of demographic assumptions typically have a much smaller impact on the results, but things like levels of ill health retirement, levels of withdrawal, so people leaving employment and going to an alternative employment not in the LGPS, levels of commutation, so people exchanging pension for lump sum at retirement. But we do look at each one of those assumptions in turn. We analyse the data across the LGPS in Scotland, and we propose a set of assumptions for each one of those. And we then look at the fund's own experience and adjust versus the LGPS average. So it's quite a detailed exercise that we work through, setting each one of those assumptions. So that's the kind of demographic assumptions. Before I move on to financial assumptions, does anyone have any questions on any of that?
Councillor Steinbank, got a question.
Yeah, thanks very much. It was just on that final point you've made at 7.14.5 on cash commutation. Just in the report it says it's going to be increased from 50% to 75%. Does that mean we're assuming 75% of our members are going to take up a lump sum? I know it might be a wee bit of a daft laddie question, I'm just trying to understand.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, so yes, it is. The way the calculations work, it effectively assumes that all members will take 75% of their maximum. In reality, people will probably take maximum or not, or somewhere in between. But yeah, that's based on the experience that we've seen in the fund. So we see quite high levels of members taking commutation, particularly in Scotland. There's a bit of a difference between I don't know why, but a bit of a difference between the pattern in Scotland and the pattern in England and Wales. But yeah, 75%, we'll assume that members will take 75% of the maximum that they can take as a lump sum tax-free.
Thanks for that. I know you might not have the stats in front of you, but in terms of the scale of the difference between ourselves and England and Wales, what's the sort of scale we're talking about?
So in England and Wales, we probably see maybe somewhere between 50% and 60%, right, on average. And that thing, the kind of prevalence within funds can be linked to things like the communications that go out to members on retirement, and how clear it is within that communication that they can take a lump sum. So we tend to see the differences can be quite fund specific, depending on, I guess, how much funds sort of promote that option or otherwise.
Thanks for that. And just my last question, it was a bit more for clarity, it was in 7.13. It's about the CMI model data. It talks about the weight that's going to be placed on the two most recent years. Is that is that linked to financial year? And if so, which years are we talking about?
Yeah, so currently the latest available model is CMI 2021, and it has the ability to allow for so the way in which that model works is it effectively has data every year, and you can say how much weight you'll place on the data from the most recent year, and so there's a parameter in that model that says how much weight effectively you place on the data across 2020 and 2021 within the CMI 2021 model, which would include the impact of COVID. However, we expect that the CMI 2022 model will be available. It is due in June, although as far as I'm aware, it hasn't been released yet. And so while we've kind of proposed the weighting based on the CMI 2021 model, if the CMI 2022 model is available, then we will adopt that and we will review each of the parameters in that, each of the there's three parameters in there. We will review each of those parameters to make sure they're appropriate for use of the CMI 2022 model.
Thank you very much. You answered my next question, which was when's 2022 going to be available. So thanks very much, Julie. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Councillor Steenbank. Another question from David Morgan, please.
Thanks, Convener. It was just a question around 7.14.1, Julie, to do with retirement, when people take retirement. It felt a little bit like an outlier to me compared to the other assumptions, because I think every other assumption is relying on the fund zone experience, whereas 7.14.1 is basically just saying we're going to make this assumption not based on what the fund is, not based on what the fund has experienced in recent years. Certainly, as an individual employer, and I can't obviously say that this will apply to other employers across the fund, but I think that we've seen an increase in number of people taking their pensions early, and I just wanted to check whether or not that was an assumption we should be making in the valuation.
Okay, so there's kind of two parts to that. So one, the reason we've set the assumption that we've used to have a really complicated retirement assumption that effectively assumed people took one bit of their pension at one time and a bit of their pension at another time, which obviously is unlikely to happen in practice. People will take their pension generally at one point in time, and that had arisen from the changes in the scheme rules where people had different eligibility to take their pension unreduced at different ages. So the reason that we've adopted that change is really just simplification. So it's just to say we expect people will take it at the earliest age that they can take it unreduced. But on your point about differing patterns of early retirement, or it might be late retirement, in those instances, the benefit is adjusted. So in theory, the adjustment should be at what we would call actuarially neutral. So if somebody's taking it early, they'll get less. And if somebody's taking it late, they'll get a bit more. So that's why we don't include an explicit allowance for that, because the outcome should be the same either way. It's more of a cash flow issue rather than a valuation of benefits issue.
That makes perfect sense. Thanks, Julie.
Councillor Spears, I believe you've got a question. Thank you.
Oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
can't hear you, Councillor Spears.
Sorry. Your assumptions are based on statistics. Do we have the statistics, the death level in the different areas, Scotland and England and in Falkirk? Because it's vitally important for the gross figure that we've got. If people are dying earlier than Falkirk District, that would probably tell us why people are taking lump sums rather than a whole pension if they're not going to live long enough to enjoy it. Do we have any of these statistics?
Yes, we do. That's what, so the life expectancy assumption will explicitly allow for the trends experienced in the postcode of each individual member of the fund. So probably when we come back later in the year and we're talking about the results of the valuation, one of the things that I can bring along is what we call a heat map, and it just shows a level of life expectancy within each postcode area. So that's the type of data that we're relying on when we're setting these assumptions.
Well, I look forward to seeing that.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Spears. Mr. Albert Chen, you've got a question?
Thanks, Convener. Hi, Julie. Just looking at the paper at 7.2.1, which talks about the discount rate. I appreciate you might be getting around to this shortly. It says there the rate that's proposed to be used in 2023 is gilts plus 1.7%. I was just curious as to what the rate was, the equivalent rate was for 2020. And if you can talk very briefly about what the implications are for choosing different discount rate margins.
Sure.
And what the options are in terms of any variation around that.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm going to come on to financial assumptions, so I could cover all of that as part of that discussion, if that's okay.
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions on the demographics before I move on to the financials? No, no, okay, great. Okay, so the other set of assumptions are the financial assumptions, and they typically impact the amount of benefit that people are going to earn, so CPI and salary increases. And then the really kind of key assumption as part of that Albert's just touched on is the discount rate. When we're setting salary increases, we typically set that assumption with reference to CPI, and we do that in really, it's very much a discussion with the fund officers. It can be quite a headline number, particularly in valuations going past. There was quite a lot of discussion around about what the salary increase assumption was. However, now it has a really small impact on the outcome of the valuation. And the reason for that is that there's a declining number of people with an eligibility for a final salary pension within the fund, and because that scheme effectively closed, the greatest majority of those members now have retired or are very close to retiring, and the amount of salary increases doesn't impact on your care benefit in the same way, because those benefits are revalued in line with CPI. And so while it can look like a really critical assumption, it actually now has a much smaller impact on the value of the liabilities. For the CPI assumption, so that one is more critical, because that's the level of benefit increase that applies to benefits, so pensions and payment, deferred revaluation. So for the members who have an eligibility for pension but haven't quite reached retirement age yet, their benefit revalues each year in line with CPI, and also current members also have that inflation protection link within the benefits they earn each year. So the way in which we set that assumption, we actually, for contribution rate purposes, and we don't rely on a single assumption, we look at lots of different scenarios, and we set contributions such that a sufficiently high proportion of those scenarios means that the fund will have enough money. But we do need to rely on a single assumption for the purposes of reporting a single liability figure. And the way in which we do that is we use that model that projects all of the different scenarios, and we take the median level of CPI from that model. So we will be reporting a higher level of CPI at this valuation than what we did at 2020, but it won't be as high as current headline figures for CPI, because that assumption is a long-term assumption. So it's not about what CPI is now, it's about an average of what we think CPI is going to be in the future. So while we expect high levels of CPI right now, we also expect lower levels in the future, and so averages out to a lower number. So just whenever we look at the results and you think that number looks unexpected, that's the reason why. And then the final assumption is the discount rate. So that's about how much money the fund are aiming to hold, and we look at the fund's investment strategy and determine what we expect the fund's investment returns to be. All of the assumptions that we adopt are what we would call best estimate. So we think there's a 50-50 chance of those assumptions being borne out in practice. But for the investment return assumption, that's where the element of prudence comes in. So you want to be more sure than not that there will be enough money there to pay those members' benefits. And as actuaries, we have a professional obligation to also be prudent in our assessment of those liabilities. The way in which we've set the discount rate assumption is we've agreed a level of prudence with the fund's officers. So that level of prudence we've set to be 75%. So that means when we're assessing any assumption that we require to be prudent, or we're assessing contribution rates, we're looking at scenarios where we want 3 out of 4 chance that assumption will be borne out in practice. And that then translates into how we set those discount rate assumptions. And so that's what gives us that gilts plus 1.7% discount rate assumption. So when we look at the fund's investment strategy, there's a 75% chance that the fund will have will be returning gilts plus 1.7% in the future. That is, so that's at what we call at the end of the time horizon, at the end of the point that we're measuring it. At 2020, that assumption was gilts plus 1.8, so we're being slightly more prudent this time round. Partly because the fund has the ability to be a little bit more prudent this time round, so we expect that the outcome of this valuation will be much more favourable than it was at 2020. The fund is able to build in a little bit more prudence, which allows for hopefully future stability and future valuations should you need it. But actually we're able to change that gilts from plus 1.8 to gilts plus 1.7, and we're able to do that comfortably without having a knock-on impact on contribution rates. Which I think, Albert, hopefully is the question that you were asking earlier on. So we don't expect that to have a significant impact on contribution rates that are paid by any of the employers in the fund. It just allows us to build in a little bit more prudence. And then the final bit of that is we have to report a funding level. So when we're setting contributions, we look at lots of different scenarios for what might happen in future economic conditions. But we have to pick a single one of those scenarios for the purposes of reporting a funding level, because we have to place a value on liabilities. And again, we'll rely on that 75% prudence margin set to do that. So we'll look at what level of investment returns will the fund earn with a 75% chance, and we'll set that value of the discount rate for the purposes of calculating liabilities. So the key bit of I guess all of the financial assumptions are that there's CPI and salary increases are set at best estimate. Prudence is built into assumptions round about future investment returns, and that will be done in line with a 75% likelihood of success, that 75% prudence margin, to make sure that the fund are the outcomes that you can have, I guess, confidence as a committee that the fund are setting a prudent funding strategy. Okay, so that's kind of, I guess, the summary of the entire set of actuarial assumptions, quite a potentially complex area. So I'm happy to take any more questions.
Do we have any questions from the members? Doesn't look like it. I've got a question. I just want to say thank you, Julie. It's really a very interesting topic, and especially when bringing data about people, how the valuation assumptions are carried out. I find that fascinating, and I do believe you do have extra data that, you know, maybe next time, like when you come back to committee, you can share. And especially how long people are living. I think everybody's interested in that. Also the demographics, because I think Scotland, the ages that people are living, I believe, are less in some areas than the south of England. So it'll be fascinating to digest all that in future. Also, the question that I do have is, you've actually regarding where is my question now? Yes, the question you've written in October, November 23, the funding strategy statement circulated for consultation. And can you tell me to whom? And will the responses be included when it comes back to committee for ratification?
Yeah, so also just that. So the funding strategy statement is issued for consultation to all of the fund's employers. Usually there's not usually many responses to that consultation, but the fund officers usually would collate any responses, and we would either update the funding strategy statement as appropriate, or respond directly to the comment. So that's quite a big, also big kind of exercise later in the year, where we really pull into one document all of the decisions that have been made throughout the evaluation process, and that's where it goes out to sharing for the employers. So Beth will definitely be bringing that back later in the year, along with any comments if should you receive any.
Thank you, Julie, for that. I do have a question from Councillor Spears.
Thank you. I don't know, Julie, if you're the person to answer it, but my concern is about the increase in age before people are pensionable. Will that affect the figures that you're working on, and also the campaign by the WASPI women who have been unfairly done out of pension for so many years? If they're successful, what level of effect will it have on our pension fund?
So it's really about we assume that members retire at the point that they're eligible for receiving their pension benefit in full, and that's currently linked to state pension age. So as you've said, as state pension age increases, then the value, you would expect a knock-on impact on the liability. So if state pension age rises, then liabilities would drop slightly, because you would be paying pension for a slightly shorter period of time. If there was a fundamental change in the state pension age, it would impact, the impact of it would depend on how many individuals were affected by that. I wouldn't expect the impact to be significant. It's not something that we generally are, when we talk about the risks of what may happen, probably a bigger risk for the pension fund is something like, whole-scale benefit change. So there's a valuation called cost cap valuation that has the ability to alter benefits paid to members. They carry out an assessment of how much the benefits cost, and if benefits become too high or too low, there's the ability to change, that's set by central government. They would change the amount of benefit accrual across the entirety of the LGPS. I would say something like that is more the type of thing that we would be keeping a closer eye on, as opposed to the case that you mentioned.
Just a man in the street comment: if we're retiring later, we're getting less pension and dying earlier. We're in a no-win situation.
So, I mean, the life expectancy is still increasing. We've seen sort of press commentary about life expectancy declining, but actually it's more about the rate with which life expectancy was increasing has slowed. So we still see an increase in life expectancy occurring over time, but it does also tend to affect different socio-economic groups differently within the population.
Thank you, Councillor. Any more questions? No. Just on that point, Councillor Spears, the WASPI campaign, I do know a wee bit about it. It's not about changing the age of state retirement pension as it is now. It's a campaign to get compensation from the government for lack of notification of the age change that happened 20 years ago. So I can't see how it could affect our pension fund. No more questions. I'll go to the recommendation. The committee and board are asked to note the proposed assumptions and process for completing the 2023 pension fund valuation. And the committee is asked to note the actuarial assumptions outlined in sections 6 and 7 of this report. Do we all agree?
Agreed.
Thank you so much. Move on again, and agenda item 9 is general governance matters, and Catherine Crothers will take this. Thank you.
Apologies up front, this is going to be a bit of a long one. We've got a lot of items in this report. I'll start first with the proposed National Care Service. This was added as a standing item and has been added to ensure developments in this area and the potential impact to the fund are considered by the Pensions Committee and Board as they arise. The bill is currently at stage 1, where general principles are decided on, and the stage 1 debate was meant to take place at the end of this month. However, it has been delayed to allow continuing engagement and co-design activities throughout the summer of 2023 before the bill moves to the next stage of the legislative process. We've heard a little bit about the cost cap from Julie, and this section builds on that cost cap mechanism which manages the risk associated with the cost of providing benefits from the scheme. It acts as a safety valve, so if things become materially more expensive or cheaper, the scheme design changes so that the cost to employers and essentially taxpayers remains fair. The costs of the scheme are reviewed each quadrennium. The last valuation took place in 2020 for the quadrennium 2019 to 2023. The initial results for that quadrennium suggested that the benefits being built up by members during this period were cheaper than expected, and as a result, members should get improved benefits. However, the discrimination identified in the MacLeod judgment, which determined that a protection given to older scheme members was age discriminatory when the scheme reformed in 2015, meant there were higher costs involved in the valuation, resulting in no change to benefits or member contributions for the period 2019 to 2023. Unsurprisingly, the decision to include those higher MacLeod remedy costs in the cost cap mechanism was challenged by the trade unions at the High Court, which ruled in favour of HM Treasury on all grounds. The judge also refused permission to appeal, but the FBU and other parties are able to apply for permission to appeal directly to the Court of Appeal. However, there's a caveat to this because Scottish ministers have yet to confirm their position, but it's not expected that the position in Scotland will be materially different from that adopted by England and Wales. The next one regards what is commonly referred to as SCAPE discount rate, and people always ask me, what does SCAPE stand for? So it's superannuation contributions adjusted for past experience. Still doesn't mean much, but that SCAPE discount rate is an estimate of how fast the economy will grow, and a government has announced that the discount rate will reduce from its current level of inflation plus 2.4% to inflation plus 1.7%. Normally, when we see a change to the SCAPE discount rate, it doesn't impact the LGPS in the way you think it would. It does impact on our factors for things like transfers in and transfers out because they are directly linked to the SCAPE discount rate. But our employer contributions are actually set with regard to scheme-specific factors and information. So unlike the unfunded public service pension schemes where they expect to see their employer contributions go up, as you've already heard from our actuary Julie, we're not expecting that same experience to happen within our fund. Additionally, while reductions in the SCAPE discount rate have previously meant that the cost cap is more likely to be breached, resulting in changes to the scheme to provide more generous benefits, which are funded by increased employer contributions, the cost cap mechanism was reviewed following the 2020 valuation to ensure it remained fit for purpose. One of the measures that was introduced as a result of that review was an economic check that's been built into the cost cap mechanism, which will stop any changes to improve benefits if those improvements are not affordable. The revaluation date for care pension was due to change on the from the 1st of April to the 6th of April last month, and it was to have retrospective force to the 1st of April. It's still intended that the amendment will happen. It's still intended that it will be retrospective to the 1st of April, but there has been a delay in laying that amending legislation. And that's down to Scottish ministers prioritising other legislation because this amendment will be retrospective. So whilst the delay is ongoing, Scottish ministers have taken the opportunity to consult on other amendments, in particular to exit payments, which I will bring back at another meeting. The change to the care evaluation date, the amendment that they're trying to bring in, is to ensure that the policy that was intended is delivered, and that policy was that any pension benefits that are built up in earlier tax years should not affect your taxable pension savings unless it grows by more than inflation. And currently that would not be the case. So the good news is we have the correction to our software that we can switch on once the regulations take force, and we can do the retrospective. But the amendment will have to be done before October because that's when we have to get out our pension savings statements. So this will be a time-defined delay. The Public Service Pensions Act 2013, among other things, requires that there is a review. It's called a Section 13 report, and it's just because that happens to be Section 13 of that legislation that requires this report to be done. And it's an independent review of every Scottish local government pension scheme fund to ensure compliance with 4 areas. Compliance with the regulations, that evaluation is not inconsistent with others, a funding plan that ensures the solvency of the fund is in place, and that there is a long-term cost-efficient funding plan. GAD reports on its findings in the report using 4 different flags. There's a red flag, which, as you can expect, flags up material issues, an amber flag, which flags up potentially material issues, white flags, which are advisory, and green flags, which indicate there are no material issues. The important thing for us is Falkirk Council Pension Fund received no amber or red flags. And you can find the actual GAD report in Appendix 2 of this report. We also have two employers within the fund who have left the fund and are no longer actively participating in the fund. And we're in the process of carrying out the activity to determine the cessation liability of these employers. Should we find a surplus, the fund will be required to pay an exit credit to the employer. That is set out in legislation. It is not discretionary. However, if a liability is identified, the employer will be required to pay the exit payment. Moving on, we've got the MacLeod remedy, which identified, as I stated earlier, identified age discrimination when the local government pension scheme reformed in 2015. This remedy is due to take effect on the 1st of October this year. Unfortunately, we don't know the full detail of the remedy. It's not yet been finalised. It is still intended that the amending regulations will be made before the 1st of October this year, but we are awaiting a consultation, a further consultation, and the response to that before the remedy actually comes into force. Therefore, to ensure a consistent approach is adopted to the accounting of MacLeod remedy costs within this year's triennial valuation, the Scottish Public Pensions Agency, on behalf of Scottish Government, issued a letter of comfort to administering authorities to advise the assumptions they should adopt when valuing past service liabilities and setting employer contribution rates, which we will be following. The key thing to note is that this letter does not preclude the event of the final amending regulations from taking a different approach from those that were outlined in the 2020 consultation. In consequence, the fund intends to take advice on the advisability of making provision in their funding strategy for the ability to revisit employer contributions if the outcome is materially different from what we're expecting. Cost transparency training. This is something that the Scottish Scheme Advisory Board has taken up, the offer of training for fund administrators and political representatives on the cost transparency system. This system aims to shine a light on costs and returns of investments in a range of different Scottish funds in the autumn of 2023. I'll update when the training days are set and I know more about this event. A placeholder, and if you wish to attend, please do let me know, is for the LGPS Governance Conference 2024, which will be held in York on the 18th and 19th of January next year.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a very detailed report. I'm going to open it up now and I see we've got Councillor Spears once again. Do you have a question? Thank you.
Thank you. Regarding the McLeod report, how does this affect people who work past pensionable age and their ability to pay ABCs into the pension?
McLeod doesn't relate to AVCs. It relates to the service that's built up between the 1st of April 2015 and the 31st of March 2022. So is it linked to your defined benefits rather than your defined contribution, which is AVCs?
Yeah, but how does that affect people who work over the pensionable age?
So for people who work over the scheme normal retirement age, in the past, we didn't take into account the impact that late retirement factors would have on the increase on pension. So the fact is that the final salary benefits are payable earlier than the care benefits. So when you're comparing one against the other, if previously we wouldn't have taken into account the late retirement factors. So again, automatically we were kind of pushing the 160th down against the 149th. The proposal, whether it actually happens or not, we wait for the regulations to be laid, is that we would take into account the late retirement factors. So that makes it more likely that an underpin might bite, but it doesn't mean it will, because the 149th on care is about 20% improvement. It's just over 20% improvement on the 160th